talk so much about strategy, and innovation and all the tangible stuff in the business world, but it's those cultural currents,
Mhm.
the ones you can't really see that can really throw even the best plans totally off course.
Yeah,
And I bet you've probably wondered, like, we have how these kind of unspoken rules really shape the world of business.
absolutely. And the stuff that you've gathered for this deep dive, it really like underscores that, when different cultural norms kind of bump up against each other in a business setting, the fallout can be pretty significant.
Oh, yeah.
It's not, just like minor awkward moments. It's full-on breakdowns in understanding damaged relationships, professional relationships, and ultimately a hit to the bottom line.
Right. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a big deal. And so our goal in this deep dive is to really like get under the skin of how these cultural differences actually play out in practical everyday business situations. We want to extract the core insights from all this great information and give everyone listening a clearer sense of, how to navigate these often really murky waters.
Right.
Our sources highlight some key areas, everything from like how we communicate and give feedback to the ways we make decisions and build trust, even how we perceive time and how we lead.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is. So let's unpack this, starting with something really fundamental. Communication.
Okay.
What's going on beneath the surface, when people from different cultures are talking to each other?
Well, one of the things that's really interesting here is this fundamental difference between what's known as high context and low context communication styles.
Okay.
So think about it this way. In low context cultures like the US or Germany,
Mm-hmm.
there's a real emphasis on being direct and explicit.
Right.
In your communication, the speaker, carries the main responsibility for making sure their message is understood clearly.
So it's like saying exactly what you mean and expecting to be taken at your word. Everything's pretty much out in the open.
Yeah, very transparent.
Right. Okay. So then on the flip side, you have high context cultures like Japan or China,
Right.
where communication relies a lot more on shared background knowledge, implicit understanding, reading between the lines.
Right.
It's as much about what's not said as what is.
Exactly. And this difference in approach can be a real breeding ground for misunderstandings.
Oh, I bet.
Someone from a low context culture might perceive someone from a high context culture as being vague, indirect, or evasive even.
Yeah.
Well, on the flip side, the person from the high context culture might see the low context communicators being really blunt, lacking in subtlety, maybe even a bit rude
Yeah.
or insensitive.
Totally. And our sources have this really great little illustration, the story about Mr. Chen and Mr. Diaz discussing a potential Sunday visit for a client.
Oh, yeah.
It shows how the indirectness, inherent in a high context approach can be so easily misinterpreted by someone who's expecting just a straightforward yes or no. It's a great example of how, assumptions can lead to these cross signals and potentially missed opportunities or even offense where none was intended.
Yeah, and it's not just about the spoken word either. We also have to be mindful of the potential for misinterpretations in nonverbal cues.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the source mentions the Indian head wobble, for example,
Right.
which can signify agreement or understanding or even just polite acknowledgement in India. But in other cultures, it can be taken as a sign of uncertainty or even disagreement.
Wow. So much room for miscommunication.
Right.
And even humor, something we often take for granted can completely miss the mark
Oh, yeah.
or even cause offense, when the cultural contexts are different.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've looked at how we talk to each other. Now, another area that seems particularly sensitive across cultures is how we give and receive feedback.
This is definitely a space where cultural norms can clash quite dramatically. Yeah, we see this really significant divide between cultures that tend to be very direct and upfront with their feedback, particularly negative feedback, and those that favor a much more indirect approach.
Okay.
Cultures like the Netherlands, Germany, and Russia, they're generally known for their directness in this regard.
So no beating around the bush there.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The priority is really on clarity and efficiency.
Right.
On the other hand, you have cultures such as Indonesia and Japan that tend to prefer a more indirect style when they deliver negative feedback,
Okay.
largely to avoid, causing offense or disrupting group harmony.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how the very same piece of feedback delivered in different ways can be received and interpreted so differently.
Oh, yeah.
Direct feedback in a culture that values indirectness can feel incredibly harsh and disrespectful.
Which brings to mind the example in our sources of the Dutch manager William giving feedback to his American subordinate about attending a meeting while also having his child at school.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Now, William might have seen that as a very straightforward comment on, time management and professional focus.
Right.
But from the American subordinate's perspective, it could easily have felt like a judgment on their personal responsibilities or a lack of understanding of their work-life balance.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's not just the directness, but also the balance between positive and negative feedback that varies significantly across cultures.
Okay, that's interesting.
Some cultures like the U.S. often employ what's been called the sandwich approach,
Okay.
cushioning negative feedback between positive remarks.
Oh.
But in a culture like France, for example, that might be seen as insincere or as diluting the important critical message.
Oh, interesting.
Conversely, the more direct French style of feedback might be perceived as overly critical and discouraging in a culture that's more accustomed to a positive preamble.
Right. So many different cultural lenses through which we interpret both giving and receiving critique. Really fascinating. Now let's shift gears and talk about how decisions actually get made in different parts of the world. It's certainly not always a simple top-down process, is it?
Absolutely not. And our sources highlight this really interesting contrast between cultures that favor consensual decision-making and those that lean more towards a top-down approach.
Okay.
Cultures like Sweden and Japan often place a high value on reaching decisions through broad consultation and building consensus among stakeholders.
Interesting.
The idea is that, everyone's voice should be heard and a general agreement is sought before moving forward.
That sounds very collaborative and inclusive, but I can also imagine it might feel rather slow
Right.
to someone coming from a different business culture.
That's precisely where potential friction can arise.
Okay.
In more top-down cultures like the U.S., there's often an expectation that a leader will make the final decision relatively quickly.
Right.
And these differing paces and expectations around decision-making can certainly lead to frustration on both sides.
Yeah.
Someone from a consensus-driven culture might perceive a top-down approach as, autocratic and not valuing their input.
Right.
While someone from a top-down culture might view the consensus-building process as inefficient and unnecessarily prolonged.
Right. The source even touches on Japan's ringi system, which is this fascinating bottom-up proposal process that really emphasizes getting buy-in at multiple levels.
Yeah.
And while it can be very effective at ensuring everyone is on board, it's easy to see how someone who's used to quicker, more hierarchical decision-making might find it a rather painstakingly slow process.
Indeed.
Now let's delve into something perhaps a bit more subtle, and that's how trust is established and nurtured in different cultural contexts.
Trust is a really interesting one.
You'd think that's a universal human element,
You would, wouldn't you?
but it seems the way we go about building it can vary quite significantly.
It really can. The sources point to this key distinction between what are called task-based and relationship-based approaches to building trust. In task-oriented cultures such as the U.S. and Australia, trust is often built through demonstrating competence, reliability, and consistently delivering on your commitments.
So it's primarily about what you do and the quality of your work?
Exactly. It's the idea of proving yourself through your actions.
Right.
But in relationship-oriented cultures like China and Brazil, trust is more deeply rooted in personal connections, mutual understanding, and emotional bonds.
Okay.
It's more about who you are as a person, and your connection to others building a strong personal relationship often precedes significant business dealings and is seen as foundational.
And this fundamental difference can lead to some really interesting cultural clashes, like the anecdote in our sources about the Argentinian manager who felt genuinely disrespected when his Norwegian clients started eating their lunch during his presentation.
Oh yeah, that's a great example.
From the Argentinian perspective, the relationship they were building and the presentation itself deserved their undivided attention as a sign of respect. But from the Norwegian perspective, getting down to the task at hand efficiently, even if it meant multitasking during a meal, was the priority.
Yeah.
It really highlights the different values placed on the interaction.
Precisely. One culture prioritizes the personal connection
Yeah.
and the shared experience,
Right.
while the other prioritizes efficiency and the completion of the task.
Interesting.
And these seemingly small differences in emphasis can have a really significant impact on how trust is perceived, built, and maintained.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about something that really dictates the pace and rhythm of business itself, our perception of schedules and time.
Time, oh yeah.
I know I can get pretty stressed when things don't stick to a strict timeline, but I gather that's not a universal feeling.
No, it's actually quite culturally influenced.
Okay.
The sources describe these concepts of linear time and flexible time orientations.
Interesting.
Linear time cultures such as Germany and Switzerland tend to view time as a linear progression, a sequence of events. They place a strong emphasis on punctuality, sticking to schedules, and following the plan. It's about doing one thing at a time and adhering strictly to deadlines.
Very structured and predictable.
Yeah.
And then you have flexible time cultures.
Exactly. Cultures like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria have a much more fluid approach to time.
Okay.
Schedules are seen more as guidelines, and there's a greater flexibility to accommodate relationships, unexpected events, and shifting priorities.
Right.
Multitasking and adapting to changing circumstances are quite common.
Yeah, I can already foresee the potential for some serious clashes there.
Oh, yeah.
Someone from a linear time culture might easily perceive someone from a flexible time culture as being unreliable,
Right.
disorganized, or not taking commitments seriously.
And the reverse is also true.
Right.
Someone from a flexible time culture might view someone from a linear time culture as being rigid, inflexible,
Yeah.
and perhaps prioritizing schedules over people and relationships.
The anecdote about the German individual being quite perplexed when a Nigerian colleague casually asked about dinner preferences 3 months in advance perfectly illustrates this.
Yeah, that's a good one.
The German mindset likely wanted a concrete plan,
Right.
while the Nigerian colleague was probably just initiating a friendly conversation and leaving things open to evolve naturally.
Exactly.
It really comes down to different underlying priorities in terms of planning and spontaneity.
That's it.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to the realm of leadership. It's clear that the way people lead and expect to be led isn't uniform across the globe either, is it?
Not at all. We see significant differences between what are termed egalitarian and hierarchical leadership styles.
Okay.
Egalitarian cultures like the Netherlands and Sweden tend to have flatter organizational structures,
Right.
where subordinates expect to have relatively direct access to and open communication with their superiors.
Okay.
There's often an emphasis on involving team members in decision-making processes.
It sounds like a more level playing field in terms of authority.
Precisely. But in more hierarchical cultures, such as China and Russia,
Right.
there's typically a much more pronounced sense of rank status and deference to authority.
Right.
Subordinates are generally expected to respect the authority of their superiors and to follow directives from the top down,
Okay.
without necessarily expecting to be involved in high-level decision-making.
So what kind of challenges might arise when these contrasting styles meet?
Well, managers from egalitarian cultures might find it challenging to elicit initiative and deference in hierarchical settings,
Right.
where employees might be more hesitant to challenge authority or take independent action without clear direction from above.
Okay.
Conversely, managers from hierarchical cultures might be perceived as overly autocratic or as not empowering their teams in more egalitarian environments where employees expect more autonomy and involvement.
Yeah.
It really boils down to differing expectations of how authority is exercised and how decisions are made within an organization.
That makes perfect sense. Now let's consider the art of persuasion. When you're trying to convince someone of an idea or a course of action, are there culturally preferred approaches?
Indeed, there are.
Okay.
The sources highlight a fascinating contrast between what are called principles first and applications first persuasion techniques.
Okay.
Cultures like France often favor a principles first approach.
Right.
They typically prefer to begin with the underlying theory, the fundamental concepts, and the philosophical principles.
Okay.
Before moving on to discuss practical applications or specific examples,
Okay.
the logic and the why behind the idea come first.
So laying a solid intellectual foundation before you get into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly.
What about applications first?
The cultures like the U.S. tend to be more applications first in their approach to persuasion.
Okay.
They generally prefer to see the practical uses and the tangible benefits up front.
Right.
They want to know how it works and what the immediate results will be before they delve into broader theoretical concepts or overarching principles.
So get straight to the point, show me the concrete results.
Exactly. And this fundamental difference can certainly lead to mismatches in communication and understanding.
Right.
The source provides the example of a Chinese executive giving a presentation in Europe.
Okay.
His more holistic, principle-based approach to the topic might not resonate as effectively with a Western audience that's expecting a detailed breakdown of specific applications data and immediate takeaways.
Yeah.
It's all about differing cultural expectations of what constitutes a convincing and compelling argument.
Interesting. Finally, let's touch on an area that can sometimes become quite sensitive, how different cultures approach and handle disagreement. Are we all equally comfortable with a good, robust debate?
Definitely not. There's quite a spectrum of approaches here,
Right.
ranging from more confrontational to decidedly avoid confrontational.
Right.
Cultures like France and Israel are often quite comfortable with open debate and even directly challenging viewpoints.
Right.
It's often seen as a healthy way to refine ideas and ultimately arrive at a better understanding or solution.
A robust exchange of ideas is welcomed, even if it gets a little heated.
Yeah, but in more avoid confrontational cultures, such as Japan and China,
Okay.
maintaining harmony and saving face are incredibly important cultural values.
Right.
Directly expressing disagreement is often viewed as impolite, disruptive to group cohesion, and potentially damaging to relationships.
So you might have the same underlying difference in opinion, but the way it's expressed, or perhaps more accurately not expressed directly, would differ quite dramatically depending on the cultural context.
Precisely what might be perceived as a normal and even constructive challenge or point of discussion in one cultural context
Right.
could be interpreted as aggressive, disrespectful, or even personally offensive in another.
Yeah.
Navigating these differences and how disagreement is handled is absolutely crucial for effective cross-cultural collaboration and avoiding unnecessary conflict.
Well, this deep dive has certainly illuminated a vast landscape of potential challenges and misunderstandings in the world of international business. The core message that really stands out is that these cultural differences aren't just quirky little variations in behavior. They are a significant and often overlooked factor that can lead to very real and tangible negative outcomes if we don't actively take the time and make the effort to understand them.
Absolutely. Developing an awareness of and a genuine respect for these differences in everything from how we communicate, provide feedback, to how we make decisions, build trust, manage our time, lead our teams, attempt to persuade others, and even how we handle disagreements is absolutely vital for navigating the complexities of international interaction successfully.
Right.
Ignoring these cultural nuances is really like trying to navigate a minefield while blindfolded. The potential for a misstep with significant consequences is always there.
So as you go about your day, whether you're collaborating with international colleagues or serving clients from different parts of the world, or even just interacting with people from diverse backgrounds within your own community, really take a moment to consider the cultural nuances that might be at play.
Yeah.
Which of these tendencies might be particularly relevant to your own specific experiences?
That's a good question.
Could a deeper understanding of these cultural differences ultimately lead to more effective and more harmonious relationships, both in your professional life and perhaps even in your personal interactions? It's definitely something valuable to keep in mind and to continue to explore and reflect upon.
It really is food for thought.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on.